Sir Lawrence, over to you.
I just want to follow up this question. You've mentioned quite a lot about Iran. You were reminded before the break about President Bush's Axis of Evil speech, in which Iran was mentioned along with North Korea as well as Iraq. And I believe, I think it's clearly in the documents and elsewhere, that in presentations of the problem of WMD, certainly when you get to the nuclear issue, Iran, Libya, North Korea were put far ahead of Iraq. So given what you're saying about the Iran issue now, I wonder why Iraq was chosen rather than Iran.
Absolutely, because they were the ones in breach of UN resolutions. If you wanted, I think I said this at the time, if you wanted to start somewhere on WMD, you started with the person who'd used them, and you started with the person who was in breach of UN resolutions. Now, we decided to take a very, very strong view on this back then. And as a result of that, countries actually, I think, did adapt their behavior, at least for a time. I think Iran certainly did change its behavior to begin with in respect of its nuclear weapons program. Libya, as you know, at the end of 2003 gave up its WMD program.
Well, that had a long history before.
I'd been working on this
for a long
from President Clinton's time, but I think it fair to say there was something.
They'd been rumbled on the AQ Khan network.
They'd been rumbled on the AQ Khan network, but it was interesting when they finally gave it up, and it was at the end of 2003. We then discovered that actually they had a more extensive program than we had thought. And the AQ Khan, I think AQ Khan at some point within the next couple of years was then put under house arrest. North Korea went back into six-party talks. Now, one of the things that is most difficult in this whole area is people sometimes say to me today, well, it's not Iraq, it's Afghanistan, or someone else says it's Pakistan, or someone else says it's Iran, or yesterday we have a conference on Yemen. I'm afraid my view is they're all part of one picture.
But I just want to clarify, because it's quite important what you've just said. As I understand it, you basically said, of course, there were a number of countries that were serious threats and were further ahead, particularly on the nuclear side, indeed much further ahead, as it now turns out, on the nuclear side. What was important about Iraq is we had a route to get at them through the United Nations, so that it was partly for the exemplary effect that we had a route to deal with this, rather than necessarily it was the most important. In other circumstances, you might have gone to deal, say, with Iraq.
We had to deal with all of them, but you're absolutely right. The reason why we focused on Iraq was of the history of UN resolutions being breached, and also, and I think this is a pretty important point, he'd used them. You know, probably not merely his own people, but thousands of people in the Iran-Iraq war.
Indeed. But, and you've also indicated that what had changed since 9/11 was the risk calculus more than the specifics of intelligence. You now think you can go down the UN route to get Iraq by focusing on their weapons of mass destruction. Does that not make the specifics of the intelligence on WMD more important than if it's just sort of part of this broader sense of the dangers of the regime?
That's absolutely correct, Sir Lawrence, and that's why it was important, obviously. We came under pressure, and in the lead up to the publication of the dossier in September 2002, we came under enormous pressure to say, well, what does our intelligence actually tell us? That's why between March 2002 and the actual publication, on the 24th of September 2002, we had further intelligence reports, and obviously the Joint Intelligence Committee was incredibly active during that period in assessing what the threat was and the evidence was.
Now, this leads us naturally to the September dossier, and we've had a lot in these hearings about the origins and production of the dossier, and I don't want to go into all of that now. But two issues do stand out. The particular question of the 45-minute claim and the more general assertion that the intelligence was beyond doubt. the 45-minute claim is very specific but very controversial. Is it fair to say that the intelligence referred to chemical, possibly biological, munitions for short-range battlefield use, but that specificity was lost in the document?
It's absolutely right that that was what it was to do with. In respect to the 45 minutes, as you know, I think it's just worth pointing out this was a headline, I think, in the Evening Standard newspaper the next day.
And the Sun and the Express.
I've said on many occasions, not least to the Butler inquiry, it would have been better to have corrected in the light of the significance it later took on. But can I just point one thing out, Sir Lawrence? She did an analysis between the publication of the dossier on the 24th of September 2002 and the BBC broadcast at the end of May 2003, which alleged that we, Downing Street, had inserted this into the dossier, probably knowing it was wrong, right? And then, of course, obviously, that then kicked off a huge controversy that goes on to this day. Between September 2002 and the end of May 2003, there were 40,000 written parliamentary questions on Iraq. It was mentioned twice. There were 5,000 oral questions. It was not mentioned at all. In the 18th of March, nobody mentions it.
I can think of a speech by Jack Straw in February where he does mention it.
But all I'm saying is that
I appreciate
ex post facto, this has taken on a far greater significance than it ever did at the time.
And I think it's taken on that significance possibly because it's taken as an indication of how evidence that may be pointed was given even more point in the way that the dossier was written. So there's a question about its impact, and we may agree that it was an immediate impact, but it's then declined. But the fact of the way that it was developed and reported was misleading. It suggested that it was something more than battlefield munitions. Did you understand the difference between the 45 minutes relating to battlefield munitions and, say, a long-range missile?
I didn't focus on it a great deal at the time because it was mentioned by me, and then, as I say, it was never actually mentioned again by me. And as I indicated to the Butler inquiry, in the light of what subsequently happened and the importance it subsequently took on, it would have most certainly been better to have corrected it. However, if I could just make this point about the where you quite rightly say, well, of course, it's not surprising it takes on significance because of all the controversy, quite rightly, over the intelligence that was wrong. It was for that very reason that we held the Hutton inquiry, which was a 6-month inquiry, precisely into whether we had indeed inserted this from Downing Street into the dossier. And of course, we didn't. And the JIC was the...
I think it's been established that in that sense, the dossier wasn't doctored by an improper insertion of false intelligence. It's more a question of how a particular bit of intelligence was interpreted and presented, losing its specificity and gaining a broader meaning. So, just to clarify from what you said, you seem to be saying that you hadn't actually paid a lot of attention to this, so that when it appeared in the foreword, and the phrase is well known about the 45 minutes, you weren't particularly aware yourself that you were saying something that went beyond what the intelligence would really allow?
Correct. And as I say, I mentioned it, I think, in my statement on the 24th of September, but I mentioned it without any great emphasis, and I mentioned, I think, in reasonably sensible terms.
But when